The waters that once strangled the earth have long since retreated, leaving behind a world crusted in salt and the silence of the dead. But as the mud dried over the ruins of a lost civilization, it didn't just bury the bones of giants. It pressurized secrets so dark that even the stars seemed to dim in their presence. We are told the flood was an ending, a definitive erasure of wickedness. But the true horror did not drown with the Nephilim. It survived in the hearts of those who had invited the darkness in. History focuses on the fall of the Watchers, the celestial fathers who traded eternity for a moment of flesh. Yet the sediment of the great deep hides a more unsettling truth: the rebellion of the mothers. These were the human women who looked into the eyes of the divine and did not blink. They were not mere victims of angelic lust. They were architects of a new, unholy reality. As the earth emerged from its watery tomb, a different kind of justice began to stir. To understand the end, we must witness the first spark of the fire. The greatest tragedy of desire ever recorded, a breach that shook the very foundation of the firmament. In the heavenly realms, all was pure, orderly, and radiant. The angels, God's messengers and warriors, stood as sentinels of divine law, created to serve with no desire beyond the will of the Almighty. But then, a subtle, catastrophic shift occurred. As they cast their gaze downward from the heights of the firmament, their eyes fell upon the earth. What they saw was human beauty, imperfect, vulnerable, and raw, and it captivated them. The women of earth, with their mortal charm and emotional depth, stirred something inside the Watchers that had never been intended to wake. Genesis 6:2 records the exact moment this sacred boundary was breached. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves from any they chose. This gaze was a theft. It was the spark that ignited a chain of rebellion and cosmic corruption. The light that once radiated from these celestial beings began to flicker like a dying candle as they stared into the abyss of human desire. High above the swirling mists of the mortal world, upon the jagged, ice-crowned peak of Mount Hermon, a shadow fell that was not cast by any cloud. 200 of the most powerful guardians, the Watchers, gathered in a silence that felt like the indrawing of a long, final breath. They stood at the very precipice of eternity, looking down at the flickering lights of human fires, their celestial hearts beating with a rhythm that had become foreign to the heavens. It was Samyaza, their leader, whose voice finally broke the stillness. A voice that once sang the harmonies of the spheres, now thick with the grit of rebellion. He feared that if he acted alone, the weight of the coming judgment would crush him while his brothers remained in the light. He demanded a covenant of blood and spirit. "Let us all swear an oath," he urged, "and bind ourselves by mutual imprecations not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing together." In that moment, 200 voices echoed the dark liturgy of the fall. They were fully aware of what they were discarding. As Jude 1:6 records, they were the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode. They were abandoning the architecture of light for the transient warmth of the clay. One by one, they stepped off the height. To those watching from below, it looked like a rain of falling stars. 200 streaks of fire descending upon the mountain, a celestial invasion masked as a miracle. When these fallen beings finally set foot upon the earth, they did not arrive as monsters, but as masterpieces of light. They moved with an impossible grace that made the very air around them seem to shimmer and stall. This was the arrival of the intoxicating strangers, beings who carried the scent of celestial gardens and the residue of stars upon their skin. When they entered the human villages, time itself seemed to surrender. The rhythmic thrum of daily labor, the grinding of grain, the hauling of water, fell into a heavy, hypnotic silence. Their voices were not merely sounds. They were melodies that resonated deep within the human soul, speaking of mysteries the mortal mind could barely fathom. The women who saw them felt a sudden, hollow ache in their chests, a hunger that felt like destiny. They looked at their brothers, their fathers, and their husbands, and suddenly the men of earth seemed like shadows made of clay. No mortal man could match the depth of an angelic gaze or the warmth of a radiance that had once stood before the throne of the Almighty. These strangers offered an intoxicating promise of a love that transcended the dirt and the rot of the world. But this beauty was laced with a chilling shadow. It was a mask of perfection stretched over a core of treason. Behind the divine smile of these celestial invaders lay the cold, calculating stillness of a spirit that had already lost its soul. The longer these women remained in the presence of the fallen ones, the more the world they knew began to dissolve. It was a subtle, terrifying erosion. Proximity to a celestial being is not like a mortal embrace. It is an exposure to a frequency the human soul was never built to sustain. Piece by piece, the divinity that the angels had stolen from the heights began to seep into the marrow of their wives, altering their very essence. The biological toll of such an unholy union began to manifest in the very fabric of their existence. Mortal blood began to thrum with a celestial cadence that the human heart was never designed to pace. A hand, once warm with the blood of ancestors, might now glow with a faint, sickly celestial light, a radiance that did not warm the skin, but burned away the human imprint. Their eyes, once reflecting the simple beauty of the harvest and the hearth, now flickered with the cold, silver fires of the abyss. They were becoming something other, neither purely clay nor truly divine, but a haunting distortion of both. The life they had known became hollow, a brittle shell of memory. The touch of a human husband no longer felt like home. It felt like a ghost. The laughter of their kin sounded like a distant, unintelligible noise. They had tasted the nectar of the heavens, and though it was poisoned by rebellion, it rendered the fruits of the earth bitter and gray. In exchange for a shadow-heavy glory, they surrendered their place in the human tapestry, drifting into a spiritual isolation as vast as the firmament. The transition from forbidden union to monstrous reality did not happen with a thunderclap, but with a cry that shattered the peace of the nursery. These were the Nephilim, the fallen ones, and their arrival signaled the end of the human era. The horror began in the cradle. These infants did not grow by the steady measure of man. They surged upward with a terrifying supernatural speed that defied every law of nature. Their bodies were a violent architecture of celestial fire and mortal clay, expanding until the homes of their mothers could no longer contain them. These were the bastard kings, inheriting the vast, shimmering power of their angelic fathers and the volatile, raw emotions of their human mothers. They possessed the intellect to command the stars and the strength to move mountains, yet they were devoid of the divine restraint that governs the heavens. The catastrophic whims of a hybrid, fueled by the ego of a god, devastated the landscape. When they were hungry, the harvests of entire provinces vanished. When they were angry, The very foundations of cities trembled and turned to dust. The world was no longer a home. It was a hunting ground. The Nephilim walked as walking eclipses, their shadows stretching across trembling civilizations that lived and died at their feet. They were a bridge to nowhere, a race of kings who saw humanity not as kin, but as ants to be trodden upon or curiosities to be consumed. The Book of Enoch whispers of the unspeakable, that having exhausted the earth's resources, they turned their teeth upon mankind itself. The earth groaned until its cries reached the ears of the Most High, demanding a reckoning for a world that had become a slaughterhouse of hybrid kings and celestial tyrants. From the throne of eternity, the Creator did not look down with anger first, but with a grief that shook the foundations of the stars. The harmony he had woven into the fabric of existence was being unraveled, drowned out by a cacophony of cries from the innocent. Every breath of the earth had become a rattle. Every thought of man was a shadow. Genesis 6 describes this divine heartbreak, noting that the Lord regretted he had made man on the earth, and his heart was deeply pained. In the high courts of heaven, the era of silent observation ended. 4 blinding figures, the generals of the Empyrean, stepped to the edge of the firmament. Michael, Gabriel, Uriel, and Raphael. They stood as sentinels atop the clouds, gazing down into the swirling darkness. Michael, as the chief instrument of God's resolve, represented the finality of the coming judgment. The transition was final. Mercy, which had long held back the tides of retribution, stepped aside to make room for the necessity of total erasure. There was no middle ground left. The infection of the fallen had reached the very marrow of creation. As the archangels prepared for war, the air itself thrummed with the weight of an impending verdict. Then, the sky did not merely rain, it broke. The firmament, once a crystalline shield between the mortal and the divine, shattered like glass under the weight of God's sorrow. This was not a storm of nature, but the grief of heaven rendered into liquid judgment. The first drops fell with the force of stones, staining the earth before the great deep burst upward to meet them. For the Nephilim, those bastard kings of a stolen earth, the terror was a new and paralyzing poison. They had spent their lives looking down upon men, their heads brushing the canopies of ancient forests, their strength unchallenged by any earthly blade. But as the waters rose, they found that height was an illusion and strength was a ghost. There is a specific horror in seeing the ground disappear when you are born to shake it. These titans, who had devoured nations and defied the stars, were suddenly reduced to thrashing shadows. Their celestial blood burned with a frantic mortal heat as the cold currents of the abyss wrapped around their ankles, then their waists, then their throats. A giant's hand, thick as an oak trunk and scarred by 1,000 wars, reached out from a swirling vortex of black water, grasping for a heaven that had turned its back. The grace of their fathers had not been inherited. Only the weight of their fall remained. As the mountains themselves began to drown, the world dissolved into a cacophony of thunder and the gargled cries of the dying. They looked to their fathers already bound in chains beneath the earth, witnessing the heavens falling to erase their very legacy. Amidst the screaming winds and the churning abyss, the ark drifted, a lone wooden splinter upon a shoreless grave. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cedar and the heavy breath of survival. But the most profound sound was the silence of the door. Genesis 7:16 tells us that after Noah and his family entered, the Lord shut him in. It was not a latch moved by human hands, but a seal of divine finality. On one side of that wood lay mercy. On the other, a world being pulled into the throat of the deep. The geography of rebellion was erased. The majestic temples built to honor the fallen, the monuments carved by the hands of giants, and the very peaks of the mountains that had witnessed the celestial descent, all vanished. The water did not just drown, it unmade. It dissolved the legacy of the Nephilim until the earth's surface was as smooth and glass-like as the firmament above. Far below, in the lightless pits of Tartarus, the fallen angels were forced to watch. Through spiritual sight that served only to sharpen their agony, they witnessed the extinction of their bloodline. They saw their children, beings of immense power, diminished to mere shadows beneath the waves. Their pride was drowned, their kingdom turned to silt. But as the waters finally began to recede, a different kind of judgment prepared to walk the dry ground. As the last of the floodwaters retreated, leaving behind a world slick with the silt of God's wrath, the silence was absolute. The giants were gone. The sky was clear. But on the cracked and sodden earth, survivors remained. Not those within the ark, but those who had been the architects of the world's ruin. The wives of the fallen stood amidst the wreckage of their cities, their skin still shimmering with the fading residue of angelic touch. They expected the waves to return and finish the work. Instead, they felt a weight descend from the firmament that made the very atmosphere crystallize. Michael, the prince of the heavenly host, stepped onto the dry ground. He did not come with the chaotic fury of the storm, but with the unyielding purpose of a divine sentinel. In his hand, he held a blade of forged light. He did not strike them. Instead, he walked a slow, deliberate circle around the clearing where the women gathered, led by the defiant and unrepentant Nama. As Michael's sword traced a line in the mud, the earth did not just part. The spiritual realm itself was severed. He was drawing the boundary that would forever separate the holy from the profane, the human from the hybrid. Michael's voice was not a sound, but a decree that vibrated in their marrow. He looked upon Naama, whose beauty remained a jagged weapon even in the face of divinity. He saw their refusal to mourn the holiness they had helped destroy. Justice would be served, but not through the mercy of a quick death. Michael did not draw his sword to take their lives. Death would have been a release into the quiet of the dust, but justice for the wives of the fallen required something far more profound. They had participated in the blurring of worlds, allowing the celestial to invade the terrestrial, and so their punishment was to become the very embodiment of that threshold. According to ancient legends and certain apocryphal traditions, these women were not allowed to perish, but were transformed to reflect their crimes. The decree settled over them like a shroud of salt and silver. Those once celebrated for a beauty that had brought angels to their knees began to feel their humanity slip away. They had once reached for the heights. Now, they were pulled toward the crushing weight of the depths. Their skin began to harden, shimmering with the iridescent, cold scales of the abyss. Their warmth evaporated into the brine of the receding floods. Their melodies, once used to enchant the watchers and turn sacred vows into dust, were stripped of holiness and infused with a predatory sorrow. In this interpretation of the post-diluvian world, they became the sirens of the deep, beings of agonizing beauty, destined to be desired forever, yet never truly loved. They became living warnings, echoes of a rebellion that could never be undone. Their songs became a frequency, that resonated with the hidden weaknesses of the human heart, luring the unwary toward the rocks where their own spirits had shattered. Michael's judgment ensured that their names would fade into the fog of myth, but their presence would linger as a permanent stain on the collective consciousness. They were condemned to wander the edges of the world, barren and beautiful, unable to bear more giants, yet capable of devouring the souls of those who succumbed to their call. As the salt air claimed their breath and the tides pulled them into the dark, the legends of mermaids and sirens began their long ascent into human folklore. These stories are the lingering echoes of Michael's judgment, the cries of the unrepentant wives, still calling out to a heaven that has turned its back. Deep within the bowels of the earth, where the light of the sun is a forgotten myth, the watchers sit in a silence that screams. Their physical chains are heavy, iron forged in the heat of divine fury. But their true prison is a prison of the senses. Held in the suffocating dark of Tartarus, they were granted the power of sight without the mercy of touch. In the gloom of their cells, their eyes fixed upon a vision they cannot escape. They watch the horizons of the new world. They see the women they once loved, those who shared their beds and bore their secrets, now drifting like shadows through the salt-heavy mist. They witness the slow, agonizing unraveling of the human minds they once cherished. A husband in chains watches as his wife's laughter curdles into the high, piercing cry of a creature meant for the abyss. He sees the scales of the siren replace the warmth of her skin, and he feels the vibration of her song, a melody of madness, reach even into the depths of his pit. There is no comfort to be offered. No word of regret can bridge the chasm between the abyss and the shore. They are forced to behold the monsters they helped create, realizing that their selfish desire did not just defy God, it shattered the very souls they claimed to adore. In this cold, eternal resonance of shared grief, they exist in the ultimate torment, watching the ones they loved become monsters under the weight of their own celestial touch. When the thick, suffocating mists of the deluge finally lifted, a new sun rose over a world that felt fundamentally changed. The mud was still soft, holding the imprints of 1 billion vanished lives, but the air was thin and quiet. Humanity stepped onto this virgin soil, fragile, humbled, and bearing the heavy weight of a second chance. As the generations multiplied, the sharp edges of memory began to soften. The screams of the giants and the radiance of the fallen were too terrible to keep in the light of day. Humans turned their trauma into tales. The mountain-leveling strength of the Nephilim became the exaggerated feats of folklore. The descent of the angels became the whimsical myths of gods visiting mortals. We buried our history in the safety of metaphor. We told our children stories of sirens in the mist and shadows in the woods, never admitting that these were family secrets written in the DNA of our ancestors. The world was washed clean, yet it remained scarred by invisible ley lines of ancient rebellion. We built our cities over the graveyards of titans, convincing ourselves the ground was solid. But the spiritual landscape still hums with the resonance of that first great fall. The great deluge was more than a cleansing of the earth. It was a mirror held up to the soul of creation, reflecting the terrible weight of a desire that refused its boundaries. We look back at the cresting waves and the sinking giants as a finished chapter, a prehistoric catastrophe buried in the silt of time. But the water did not just wash away the mud. It codified a law that vibrates through the foundations of our reality. It stands as a silent, monolithic warning. There are lines drawn by the finger of God that, once crossed, turn the very essence of a being into a monument of regret. To reach for the forbidden is not merely to break a rule. It is to invite a transformation that no mortal heart is built to survive. We see this in the lingering shadows of those who remained. Even now, when the moon pulls at the restless tides of our modern oceans, the echoes of that ancient judgment remain. In the lightless canyons of the Atlantic and the jagged reefs of the Pacific, the sirens still sing. Their voices a beautiful, agonizing reminder of a grace that was bartered for a curse. They are the eternal sentinels of the deep, beautiful yet barren, desired but never truly loved. And far below them, in the tectonic grip of the abyss, the fallen still grieve. They are forced to endure the most exquisite torture of the spirit, to watch the object of their rebellion wander the earth as a creature of the shadows, unable to reach out a hand to comfort the sorrow they themselves authored. Heaven continues its watch, its gaze as piercing and unwavering as a sun that never sets. The flood has long since receded, but the question remains anchored in the currents of our own lives. What choices are we making in the quiet of our hearts today that will echo in the floods of tomorrow?